quite a few years. And we will be at the MACHE conference actually this weekend. If any of you are going to be there, we will stop by our booth, talk to us. We're happy to talk with you further about your kids' results and what you learned here tonight, as well as anything else we can do. But this should be about one 1 hour meeting tonight. We're going to go through a lot of things about the tests that the students did online with the Gibson test, what all that means. I think you'll find this really helpful. It's going to give you a new perspective on how your child learns, different than what you may have thought about before, and it can be really helpful in figuring out how to better, teach them, what kind of curriculum is going to be best, and many other things. So I think you'll find the hour well worthwhile. At the end, we do have some opportunity. If you have questions, Rich and I'd be happy to keep, answer any questions you have. We're going to have a couple opportunities. You can get some follow-up information from us as well. Along the way tonight, feel free to put things in the chat. Rich will be responding to that as I'm leading the presentation this evening. All right, so I am going to share my screen and then go through a PowerPoint with some explanation. And then we'll have an opportunity to explain in some detail what each of you found with your own kids.
Get out of there. Get.
Hello? If you have a copy of your kids' results, that's a good thing to have from the Gibson test that they took, because we're going to walk through page by page and explain a lot of what that means as well as we get later into this and tonight's conversation. So I think we've got just about everybody here. There's nobody else waiting, so I'm going to switch over to the presentation and share a screen.
Can you hear me?
You guys all see the screen sharing now?
Yes.
All right. So this is what we're going to go through this evening. I want to explain a bit about LearningRx and the cognitive skills and the Gibson Institute. As I said, my name is Baird Johnson, and I work here in the Twin Cities. So does Rich. Let me explain a bit about kind of what we're doing here when we talk about cognitive skills and LearningRx and the Gibson Institute and how this all fits together. So as I say, we partner with MACHE. Our organization is called LearningRx. We are an international organization that does one-on-one cognitive training all over the world. We have centers that we do this in person with students. Literally think of it like having a personal trainer for your brain in terms of working with kids and adults to improve how they learn, not by teaching them, but by actually strengthening the brain. We're working in partnership with a nonprofit called the Gibson Institute of Cognitive Research. They are a leading nonprofit sponsoring a lot of research around cognitive skills and how they impact learning. They have over 20 some studies in progress now. I think they've got up to 20 that have been published and peer reviewed about cognitive training and how that impacts learning. They also are the developers of the Gibson test, which is the online test that your students took. This is a normed and validated test. It's similar to the kind of tests you would get with a psychologist in terms of this kind of testing, but instead of costing thousands of dollars, Dr. Gibson, who founded the Gibson Institute, really developed this test as a way to make this kind of testing much more readily available to parents and other people so they can understand how their kids learn better. So that's what you're benefiting from tonight. It normally is something you have to purchase, but with our partnership with MACHE, we've made it available to MACHE members through this process. So you guys can benefit from that as your MACHE membership, and you can help your kids better learn that way. So a little bit of background about the Gibson test. It is actually at this point the largest normative database of adults and children of any major digital cognitive assessment. It's based on the Telhorn-Carroll theory of intelligence, which we're going to talk about later in this presentation. It's got very strong psychometric properties in terms of its ability to be replicable and accurate. And it's the only cognitive digital assessment that measures auditory processing and word attack. So if you have kids who are having trouble with reading, this is a critical skill we're going to talk about as well. And it's in 14 languages. If you want to find out more, the link below has information about the norming and validation of the test. Plus, if you go to gibsontest.com, there's all kinds of information if you're one of these people who's really interested in understanding the psychometrics of all of this. But I want to explain conceptually what cognitive skills are and how they impact learning. And the image you're seeing on your screen now is the model of intelligence based on what's called the Kittelhorn-Carroll theory. Basically, it's a concept that's been evolved over about the last 30 years in psychology to explain kind of different brain processes in terms of how people learn and how they process information. And it explains the type of skills that we measured in the testing we did with your kids. You think about this in terms of you're teaching your kids every day how to learn, and a lot of what you're focused on is how do you impart knowledge to your child? And you impart that by teaching them history, you teach them science, you teach them mathematics, and this is conceptually what we have here with the knowledge bank in terms of how do you fill up that knowledge bank as someone is learning. That's not the part of learning that we're going to talk about today. You can do all kinds of testing that tests math proficiency or knowledge of history or all these things. What we look at is how the brain processes information. It's called cognitive skills, and they're represented on this model in terms of these circles and these gears. And it's all about how your brain processes the information, not the information itself. Okay? And so the circles listed here are what we mean when we say cognitive skills. And these are the skills that we did test with your kids on that test online. Now, to explain these skills and make it real for parents, what I like to do is have somebody do a quick little exercise so I can demonstrate how these skills work in your own brain. Is there anyone here who's willing to put themselves out there and be a volunteer for a quick little exercise to help me demonstrate these cognitive skills? Just speak up. No takers at all. Come on.
I'll do it.
All right. Who's that? What's your name?
My name is Kyle.
Kyle. All right, Kyle. You are going to be my volunteer. And what I want you to do, first of all, is I want you to spell your first name out loud.
Kyle.
Right. Now, think about what you had to do there. You think about the image here where it starts with input. First thing you had to do was pay attention to my question, right? And you had to hold the question in your working memory and you had to process it. But with just those three automatic skills, you can pretty much come back with KYLE without engaging a whole lot of higher level thinking, right? And your brain pretty much makes a decision there in that gearbox saying, I know this, boom, I can go directly to the output and come back with KYLE. Now this time, Kyle, what I want you to do is I want you to spell the last name of the first United States president backwards.
NOTGNISAW.
Perfect. Now, it took you a lot longer to do that than it did to spell Kyle, right?
Yep.
Your brain had to do a whole lot more things. And if you think about that, when I asked that question, you had to go through the same process at the beginning where you paid attention to the question, you held it in your working memory, and you processed it. But when you got to the gearbox, you didn't start answering right away like you did with Kyle. You paused, you kind of leaned back, your eyes kind of looked up, and the whole time for those first few seconds, you're engaging some logic and reasoning, kind of saying, okay, what's he asking me to do? How am I going to do this? And you had to come up with a plan. That's the logic and reasoning. You had to use long-term memory to recall who was the first US president, what was his last name, how was it spelled. And then generally you'd use one of the two skills at the top there, either auditory processing or visual processing to solve this. If you use auditory processing, you can actually, that's your brain's ability to think it sounds. And you could try to sound it out backwards by going like, like this. Or you can use visual processing, which is creating a picture in your mind. And it looked like as I was watching you, Kyle, you were kind of looking up. Were you actually seeing the word Washington in your brain as you were doing that?
Yes.
Yes. And I'm not surprised because because you pretty much read that off without hesitation. But some people can't create a picture in their mind as easily. If that's not a natural thing, if you don't have that clear picture, people will stumble a lot more with trying to do that. Okay. But you had to pull all these different skills together in order to solve that problem. Okay. Now, if you think about, your kids learning and they're trying to learn and you're trying to teach knowledge to them, and sometimes they just kind of look at you like, what? Or something is particularly hard. This is helpful to understand where they're getting stuck. If you think about a skill like reading, in Learning RX, we deal with kids with reading issues more than anything else. And when you think about what your brain is doing as you're reading, you're doing all these skills simultaneously. Many times it starts with this auditory processing. If your brain actually can't discriminate the sounds in a word, and this is down to the sounds like saying, can I hear if the word cat is got cat? And people assume everybody can hear that, but that's not always the case. My oldest daughter, who struggled with reading and is the reason I got involved with Learning RX 15 years ago, would tell me way back then, she'd say, no, Dad, cats is just one sound. What are you talking about? She couldn't actually tease that out very well. Well, when that's the case, these kids often struggle right away from, how decoding a word, and they're not even hearing it. You don't realize they're not hearing these distinct sounds. But then when you get beyond that, think about how do you comprehend? Well, once you can sound out a word, if you can you remember it? Or are you not paying attention? Visual processing is a huge thing. If you have, you can't translate the word into a picture, how do you recall what you read? So all these skills have to happen simultaneously. And this is where we delve in. And it's really helpful to understand how a student learns when you start thinking in terms of these cognitive skills. All right. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through each of these individually and actually show you some examples of what your kids saw on the Gibson test as they took it. And then we'll also talk about some, examples of how this impacts learning as well. And then we'll actually get into the actual test results so you guys can think about this in terms of your own kids' results. First thing is memory. Now, you notice in the learning model, there were two different types of memory that we listed, and there's actually multiple different kinds of memory. There's like auditory and visual, but the main categories are working memory versus long-term memory. And we think about working memory, this is a short-term kind of few seconds of memory as you're thinking about something, not just holding your head, but actually manipulating it. And like on the Gibson test, I don't know if you guys watched your kids do it, but there were screens that would come up similar to this here, where it'd have like colored balloons, and the balloons might have images on them, and there are sheds. And it would appear for a period of time, and then it would go away. And on the Gibson test, the child would be asked, well, how many balloons were there? What colors were they? And so that kind of immediate, a few seconds later response, it's there, it goes away. That's working memory. And it's really helpful for, thinking about things in real time. You've got a student in a classroom who's following along. A lot of times you can get a kid where the teacher gives instructions and then all the kids are working, but one kid's sitting there kind of looking around like they don't know what to do. Sometimes the teacher will blame, say, we're not paying attention, but often they literally have forgotten it that quickly. Also critical for reading, if you think about if you've ever got to the end of a paragraph and you're like, wait, what did I just read? If you're losing things quickly, it impairs your comprehension there. Now, long-term memory is obviously long-term, but the way we test it, it's not like we're asking your kids what they learned 5 years ago or what happened to them last summer. It's new information that they have to put into long-term memory and retrieve it. So like with the Gibson test, what it'll do, it would have an image like this, and then maybe a few months later, it would come back and ask a question. How many balloons were there on that, in the balloon picture? And could they still remember that there were 3? Could they still remember later on that they were colored, even after they had done other things in the interim? And long-term memory is obviously critical for things like taking tests, recalling things that you've learned, recalling past experiences. Very critical skill for any kind of learning and education. But it is different than working memory. Visual processing, if you think about this is like your mind's eye. It's not how well you see, it's actually how you process what you see. And it's really how your brain processes information into images. Like on the Gibson test, a lot of what the exercise of measuring this would have things like these pictures here, where it is like a puzzle piece. And the child has to pick out which one actually completes the puzzle. Well, how do these pieces go together? And think about in their head, how do you rotate information? And there can be both 2-dimensional elements to this as well as 3-dimensional. On a lot of the testing we do at Learning RX, we would give them a rotated object. What's this look like from the other side? And can they actually visualize how things look in 3-dimensional space? Again, for some people, this comes naturally, for others, it doesn't. But all these are skills that you can improve through training. Visual processing from a learning, is very important for anything like instructions like maps or graphs. It's even critical in real life. If you ever notice, some kids will learn a dance routine easily because they can visualize how their body moves in space. Sports plays, if you can visualize, you play football, can you read a card? Okay, you're gonna go down, you go post pattern. How do you translate this into pictures? Absolutely critical for comprehension. I can have kids who will come to Learning RX and they will read like a passage beautifully and they'll describe a sunset and a pirate ship and there's colors and there's sails and there's people. And I ask them, what'd you see in your mind? And they're like, nothing. I'm like, but wait, you just painted a picture for me. You didn't see it? Nope, I just read the words, but some people don't create that picture. And so this is a skill that you can think about too. Some people are naturally visual and they can do that. But if you can't, it's a skill that can help to be developed. Logic and reasoning is another cognitive skill. This is all about solving problems, figuring things out, sequencing. Like on the Gibson test, there would be a lot of questions like what you're seeing here on the screen now. We got 3 out of 4 boxes filled in, and the question is select which of the objects completes the box. In this case, it's kind of obvious. That's the horizontal ellipse like that, but it gets harder and harder as you think about multiple things. How do you complete the pattern? You can measure it with this kind of testing, and then where it comes into play, really importantly, is like higher thinking skills, problem solving. Anything with math where it gets beyond just, I'm going to memorize my math tables, but can I do a word problem? Can I actually take the information and know what's important and what's not, and how to build steps to get to an answer? It's often a singular skill for IQ, which is general intelligence. But when we do IQ, we actually incorporate a lot more than that. Another skill is processing speed. This is a pure speed measure. If you think about processing speed, it's really like a computer where you get a new computer versus the old computer. And the new computer gets there faster, even though both get the same answer. And people are like this too. Some people, if you ever notice, are really quick. They can, be the first one to get an answer, like a debater. And there's other people equally intelligent, but you might notice they just need a little more time. In a group, they might be the last one to get a joke. They got there, but they took just an extra half second to process the information. And this is something good to know because some people will sit there and think, and you're like, well, are you getting it or not? But they just need time. On the Gibson test, a lot of things happen quickly with this. There'll be images like what you see here on the screen. It'll flash up there and you got to say, okay, which 2 are the same? And as quick as they can, they got to click on, in this case, the 2 snowflake characters. It's not a hard thing to figure out, but the quicker you can do that is actually measurable. And some people can do that really quickly, others can't, but this is a way of measuring processing speed. That's a really quick, important skill in learning, in terms of the quickness of decision-making. Reaction time, again, thinking on your feet. Recall fluency is how quickly you can recall things. We'll often say in a minute, how many different animals can you come up with? In 30 seconds, how many words that begin with "b" can you come up with? And these are important, measurable skills, and then it becomes critical in things like time tests. Kids who have slow processing speed often score worse on a time test because they can't finish it in the time given. Now, auditory processing. This is a really critical skill for reading. And it is not your hearing ability, but it's how your brain processes what you hear. So this is more of a brain skill. And it is the single biggest thing we find for young kids struggling with reading. And how we'll measure this. This is like really getting down to, can you hear the sounds within a word? So in like a test of this, there will be things like, can you say the word "prelf" without the sound, for example? And can the child come back with "prel"? Hear the difference between a "prelf" and a "prel"? It's slightly different, but can they pick it out? Can you say something like "melfrancend" without the "n" and hear a "melfracid"? Slightly different. Now, this is where some of the limitations of the digital tests come into play. In our in-person testing, we'll have the child actually say these things and repeat it and say it out loud. With the digital test, we can't do that, and it's more multiple choice. But it is another way to measure this. And this is a skill when kids can't do this. This often, you see this right away. These are the kids who often fall behind in reading. And they just can't, they can't decode the words. It's really hard for them to sound something out. And it impacts not just things like English, but any phonetic language. Kids who have the skill often struggle with learning a phonetic language like French or Spanish, where it's the same process of blending sounds. Another skill is word attack. And word attack is actually not a cognitive skill, but we test it with that because it's so critical for reading. Word attack is actually the applied version of auditory processing. And it's actually translate the sounds, and it literally is measuring the ability to sound out an unknown word. And with this, we will use nonsense reading. So it's the reason we use nonsense words is so that it's not something a child has seen before. If you ask them to pronounce a word they've seen before, it's a memory test. But if you ask them to sound something like app, that's obviously pronounced app, but you don't see that as a word. FO is fa. And that wouldn't be fo, it would actually be fa because we're using the short vowel sounds. So when you see a word attack score in the Gibson test, this is actually the student had been presented with different sounds and letters. Could they pronounce them properly? But this is the single biggest skill applied for kids who struggle with decoding words. And when you start an early reader, this is step one. It doesn't come into an IQ score because it's not part of actually a cognitive skill, but it's an applied skill that we find goes very importantly along with all the cognitive skills and understanding how your child learns. And then, of course, attention. We all know what attention is, but it's not just one thing, actually. So you can be distracted like a dog, squirrel, and they're continually distracted. That's what people think of. But it can also be like the ability to sustain attention, like staying on task for a long period of time can be a different type of attention. Classically, people think of this as involving a hyperactivity, a kid who can't sit still, but it doesn't have to. It can also be just the ability to you can be sitting still, but not focused. The mind's wandering, losing input, losing interest. It's often mistaken for many of these other skills because people are like, well, you weren't paying attention, but it can be, again, forgetting. So for example, if you ever give your kid 3 things to do, like go make your bed, brush your teeth, comb your hair, and then what happens? They go do 1 and then they're off playing video games or whatever. And you're like, well, you weren't paying attention. Sometimes it can be attention, but it also can be memory sometimes where they were paying attention, but they literally forgot. And this is where teasing out these cognitive skills can be really, really helpful. And then IQ, you're going to see an IQ score from the Gibson test too. Realize that this is a composite score. This is not one thing. It's actually a weighted average of multiple different cognitive skills. And it's a general measure of intelligence. It's interesting to know, and everybody always is curious about their kids' IQ. From our perspective, when we're training kids, we don't focus on IQ because it kind of merges together, and you can have a student who's got high skills in one things and low in the other, and they average out. Oh, he's average. But that doesn't tell you the detail behind it. So it does mesh things into one number, and it's interesting, but it can obscure some of the detail behind it. So we're going to look at all the different sub-skills that go into this. But you also do get an IQ score with the Gibson test. All right. Everybody with me so far? All right. Now, if you want to know more information about the Gibson test, it is online. You can see some of the technical manual links here. But now what I want to do is, I know you guys are curious how this impacts your own kids. And I want to walk through the actual test results and how to interpret this. And I'm going to give you some general understanding of it. And then again, if you have some specifics about your own kids, we can talk a little generally at the end, but I also would encourage you, if you want to have a detailed conversation, to set up a meeting with us afterwards, and we're happy to go into more detail in that way. But if you have your report, I would encourage you to get it out and take a look. If you have it online, or I like using paper myself, I'm old. But I'm going to go through each of the pages. First page is just an overview of the test. It explains some of the detail behind it, talks about the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, all those things we just talked about. And on the second page, you're going to get a graph like this, or you may not. This graph, if you have it, It's a horizontal graph. It looks like this. It's colored. This is not the test results. And I always have to explain this. This skill where it says learning scale, skills rating scale comes from a survey that you may or may not have done. There's a part of the test in the beginning. If you did this, you might have seen this option where it takes you to a parent survey and it has a whole bunch of questions like these. Or you may have been, if you did this, you'll remember it. If you didn't, you won't have this graph on there. But what this horizontal bar graph is showing is the results of a survey like this. And I think there's about 64 different questions that a parent is asked about. Is the child, for example, distracted from the task at hand? Less or more often than the average kid? Is their reading slow? Do they have poor reading comprehension? Anyway, this is a bunch of questions that a parent would have filled out with the Gibson test. And if you did that part of the test, you would have a graph like this on your test report. It's on the second page. And the way you read this is just the bigger number means it's more of a concern. So anything in red is a significant concern. Anything in green is a minimal concern. And orange and yellow are kind of in the middle. So it's a way of correlating what a parent is seeing. And it's often interesting to look at and compare this in terms of what you answered those questions versus what the actual test results showed. But that's what that horizontal bar graph is measuring. It's measuring that survey result that you may or may not have done. If you don't have that graph, don't worry about it. It just means you didn't do that part of the test. Now, as we get into the actual test results, this happens on page 3 of the Gibson test printout. You'll see a table like this. And what this is showing, it lists the particular skill that was tested, description of it, some different ways to measure it in terms of age equivalent, standard score, and percentiles. And I want to explain what each of those are. Standard score, which is the number over to the second column from the right, it's a statistical measure. Most parents don't look at this, but so you know what that is measuring. Takes all the data of all the thousands of people who have done this, same age as your kid, and creates a bell curve distribution. And it's a forced distribution of where 100 is the average. And then it goes more or less than that. And as you think about it, basically a fourth of the kids are below 90, a fourth between 90 and 100, a fourth between 100 and 110, and a fourth above 110. That's just what a standard score is. It's kind of hard to think about conceptually, but that's what a standard score is measuring. Now, what most parents are interested in is percentiles. I think are a little easier to understand. That's the number off to the far right. And what percentiles are, if you think about pick 100 kids exactly the age of your child. So I'm looking at one here of a test, a child was 8.6 years old. And their percentile ranking, if they were 61st, what that means is that if you took a random sample of all kids exactly that age, 8.6, 61st means that the child scored better than 61% of the people and worse than 39. So it's a number between 0 and 100. And so when we get back to, if I go back to the chart here where this student example, they're at the 93rd percentile in long-term memory. That means they did better than 93 out of 100 people their age. And so the next graph you're going to get in your child's test results will look something like this, where you'll have percentiles on a dot map, percentile graph from 0 to 100. And what this means is, like, for example, the child here in this example, they're 10.7 years old. And it means out of 100 kids, exactly 10.7. Their score on long-term memory at 47 means they're just a shade below average. 50 would be average. So this child here has an average long-term memory and an average working memory, but is very high on visual processing. At the same time, they're very low on logic and reasoning, medium on processing speed, and then low on auditory processing. And honestly, just glancing at this particular image, a 10-year-old with low auditory processing and English word attack, it's highly likely this child probably is struggling with reading because they're not processing sounds well, even though they can visualize information. And this is where a child like this might seem very intelligent. You could give them Legos and they could figure out all kinds of complicated things with the visual processing of Legos, but then you put a book in front of them, they can't even sound out the most basic words. Okay, so with your child, you're thinking about, this is kind of a graph I like to look at a lot. And you can think in terms of the ones above the line, these are often your child's strengths, and the ones below often will correlate with things you're finding they have trouble learning, processing. Now, as you think about percentiles, keep in mind that this is a whole broad section of kids across the country. And a lot of times the school will say, well, the child is in the average range, and that's just fine. And so the average range is really anything between like 65 and 35. And that's great. If you think about that bell curve we had up earlier, that's the bulk of the kids. But if your kid is down at like 40 percentile, a lot of parents are like, no, still they're struggling because they're in a class where most of the kids are above average. When you think about these averages, there's also data, the average kid in Minnesota, it's interesting. If you look at all the data, you often find that there's like a national average, there's a Minnesota average, there's a local average. And so we look a lot in terms of college-bound students. Because if you're going to college, you're not competing with the average person your age. The average college-bound student typically is like at 75th percentile. And this is based on research. If you think about, measuring kids who are 18, those going to college versus the whole 18-year-old set, you're tripping off the smarter group. Doesn't mean you won't get to college if you're not 75, but it does mean that that's the kind of level of intelligence you're competing with there. And so when we get people coming into our center, a lot of times if their numbers are like this, where it's 47, 46, yeah, but he can't remember as well as his classmates. That's because even though he's average for his age, he's probably below the average of the class. So all this data is, is relative, but I try and give you some of these benchmarks to interpret this so you can think about how, the numbers you got for your child, what they might mean. The next graph on the chart you'll see is a spider web graph. And really what this is you take those same percentile numbers and you plot them radially from the center out. So this is that same student we saw a minute ago, and you can see he had a very strong visual processing, so that one sticks out, whereas his auditory processing is weak. That's just another way to kind of visualize the data and think about a child's strengths and weaknesses. In our training, we always are measuring improvement. So what we look at is we take a graph like this, and then after working with a child for months, we can show how the whole skill set is improved. And we're often trying to even out the skill set so he's not so dependent on one skill. Then you're going to get a couple of graphs that are bar graphs, and these are the age equivalent graphs. So if you look at this one here, on the first graph where it's got things above and below like this, what you're looking at is age data above and below the student's average. So on the graph that looks like this, the 0 line is actually the current student's age. So like the same 10.7-year-old kid, what it shows, you remember his skills on memory were just slightly below average. What it means is like his working memory score was about half a year below average. His logic, though, was about 3 years behind. So instead of being 10, he's 7. Whereas the visual processing, 7 years ahead. He scored like a 17-year-old. So this graph is showing plus or minus relative to the current age. And then the second graph you're going to see is just the same data. When a graph looks like this is the actual age equivalent data. So again, this student who was 10.7 when he took this test, he scored like, a little below average. It's a younger 10-year-old on memory, scored like an 18-year-old on visual, scored like a 7-year-old on logic, and a 7-year-old on auditory processing. And again, when I look at a kid like this, often he's 3 years behind in auditory processing. Often this is a kid who's going to have trouble with reading because sounds and things are hard to decode. And then the last couple pages of the test, or of the test report, is a description of these cognitive skills. So if you don't remember everything I went over today, you can always reference back to that. We're also recording this today, so we will have a recorded version if you ever want to go back and hear this again for some reason or share it with somebody else. So that's the Gibson test and those results. What we're going to do we got like 20 more minutes here, and I've got some different options. One is We have time to take some general questions today about all of this.
Is that Lolo? No.
Secondly, if you're interested in or concerned about your own students' test scores and you want to discuss it in depth, we have a couple different options for you. Number one is we're happy for no charge to schedule a 15-minute call to discuss your kids' test results. Just a couple of ways you can do that. You can just text right now, Rich will record and we'll follow up with you. Or when we put
mean,
phone numbers up, you can call
chat-
one of our centers
chat right
later and just
now.
say, "You're
Chat
on a
right now,
shared
not text.
presentation."
Yeah. Chat, not text.
Chat.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Sorry. Put it in the chat box. And we'll get that. Also, if you're interested in getting help for your kid, what we do, this test is designed to be a quick screen. It took less than an hour, give you kind of a snapshot of where your kid's at today. If your kid is really struggling, you may want to think about doing a more professional assessment in person. What we use at LearningRx as our input is called the Woodcock-Johnson 4 test of cognitive abilities. This is a test similar to the Gibson test, but it's actually even more robust. It's done in person with a certified assessor. We can control the environment. And this is a good way to validate if you feel like these test results don't reflect your kid, or you think that there may be something else. This is something else we're also willing to do for a discount for MACHE members. This we do in all of our LearningRx centers. We're throughout the Twin Cities. For people out state, we also do this through Zoom. Call us up, we can schedule a remote test this way. And this includes not just the assessment, but also a follow-up meeting to discuss the results. And this is our input process to even consider how we talk about helping a child. And we're giving a half price deal from MACHE. Just when you call, mention MACHE. And we'll do this for just $99 as a follow-up to this, if that's something you're interested in. And again, if you're interested in actually helping your child improve these skills, this would be the first step to that process as well. So those are all options you can keep in mind or follow up on if you want to chat with Rich. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the next page, and this is how you can get in touch with any of our centers. We have, again, throughout the Twin Cities, including Hudson, Wisconsin. Feel free to call any of those, or you can check us out on our website and send us a message. But for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm happy to entertain any questions that any of you may have right now that we can help with. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, so my daughter is 7 and she took the, we did the assessment, and she, I think part of the problem for her is she's not reading yet. And, I've heard so many mixed things about, well, at 7, she should be reading. Well, at 7, maybe she shouldn't be, and I think that's what I'm running into is she really doesn't have a super interest in reading. And so, I think that was a little hard for us when we took the assessment because I had to read it to her and then do it. So I think probably that skewed it a little bit. But what is your assessment on having her, should she be reading at 7?
Well, most kids are reading somewhat at 7. I mean,
Okay.
how did she do? I mean, if you look at that test, I mean, when she had like those letters and sound, when she was having to hear those, if you shouldn't have been helping her with that, if she could actually, those questions she should have been able to answer without actually reading it, where she was hearing sounds and having to pick out the letters and things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did
That's-
okay. I mean, she's 7. She's scored at about 5. She's behind, except on one thing, she's way ahead. And she scored, her range was between an age of 5.5 up to 9.5. So, but the 9.5 was just logic and reasoning. So she scored really high in logic and reasoning.
Yep. And I would bet that when you talk to she probably comes across as highly intelligent. Just talking to her, she can probably think at a level like a 9-year-old and can learn at that level. But when you're describing as a kid that often has reading issues, because even though she she's above average in those kind of skills, that's a child where if she's scoring more like a 5.5-year-old level on auditory processing or word attack, she
Sure.
probably is struggling with reading.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And she scored it for the word attack. That one, she scored it just about a little over 6. So
Right.
yeah.
And that makes sense. So if
So
you think about that in that bar graph, she's probably showing like a year behind on her ability to decode words.
okay. Okay.
Which for a 7-year-old is the foundational skill that you're learning at that age in terms of your reading journey.
Sure. Sure. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that a learning issue, or is that a mom not teaching her well issue? I mean, it could be both.
What I find is it's almost always not the mom's fault, particularly when you're doing homeschool. Mom is generally trying really hard. And
Sure.
often has a good curriculum. You're going through it, and it may be the same thing you did with your other kids,
Hmm.
but they're not getting it. And so
Yeah.
it's rare when we see a kid like this where it's a teacher problem. It can be, but that's where this test
Yeah.
can be helpful. But what you're describing where the skill set is actually below her age,
Hmm.
she's probably also having difficulty processing sounds. And that's
Okay.
why she's finding reading hard,
Okay.
even though she's quite intelligent overall in terms of her logic and those kind of skills.
Sure. Well, great.
So
Well,
that is the kind of kid that honestly is a typical 7-year-old that we would see here at Learning RX in terms of
sure.
trying to help them
Okay.
catch up.
Yeah.
And we would
Okay.
do that by, and what we do is we isolate and work on actually improving those skills. So
Sure.
if you think about your daughter, if we increase that ability to process sounds, so she were like a 7-year-old level, then
Hmm.
she could start to catch up because she could decode the words and she's already got the logic to comprehend it.
Sure. Makes sense. Very good. I
That's
appreciate
how
it.
we think about it. Yeah. So if you
Yeah.
want to do the follow-up, we'd be happy to actually do a more robust test with the Woodcock Johnson. Might be a good next step.
Okay.
We don't diagnose learning issues. That's not our
No.
thing, but we actually try and say, this is why. It helps you think about how she's learning. And if it's to a point where you feel like it's a problem, then we can talk about, how we get some training to help her get caught up.
Okay. Very good. Yes. I provided my email. So yes, I think I would like to check into that. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for asking the question.
Hmm.
Anybody else got questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Tina.
My daughter was last year evaluated for ADHD, and the woman that we worked with said that my daughter has a high IQ, and she was basically saying that whatever the test that they did, there just seemed to be such a discrepancy between the different types of learning, or I don't know what the term is that you're calling all of these. But
Yes.
I was just wondering, if the parts that the discrepancy is either like she's average or she's like years beyond. And is that when there's a discrepancy, how do you even decide, should we go and get further testing versus just see if the parts where she has more of a challenge, eventually become more developed as she gets older?
Yes. Yeah. And this is what we see with so many kids. There's often big discrepancies where some skills will be way ahead and others will be, behind. And all of these skills are going to get stronger as the child is growing up. So if you think about if she's 2 years behind on a skill, next year she's going to get a little better at it, but so is everybody else. And so even though she's increasing, a lot of times they're falling farther behind because they're increasing at a rate less than everybody else is increasing.
Mhm.
And this is where we find it is helpful to get, some training if that's the case, because it's hard to close that gap. Like with reading, some of the statistics on reading, we find the average kid who is behind in reading after 3rd grade doesn't usually catch up, because even though the school is putting extra help in, the parents are working, there's extra tutor, everybody else has already moved beyond that. And so you've got to do something beyond the norm to actually to close a gap like that. And
Okay.
so I wouldn't assume a child, it's gonna close on its own. Often a child will there can be different, they can develop at different rates, and sometimes they'll pass a threshold. But if you find that they're consistently struggling, and it's more than just, like one subject or 1 year, if you find each year they're still falling behind, even though you're putting extra emphasis in there, then I
Mhm.
would have, tested, and we can talk about what a training program might look like to help, help them close that gap.
Okay. And I'm also sitting here really confused because the testing that this person did with my daughter is talking about all these attention issues, and then with this test that she took with you with the Gibson test, she scored very high on all this holding attention, and like basically I got complete opposite data that I got from these other people in the fall. So now I'm extra
you-
confused, except
Well,
that
was the testing you did previously, was it like through a neuropsych?
there's a psychological, I have two reports. One says psychological testing report, and they recommended that we get her tested for a potential learning disability because there was such a discrepancy of whatever was presenting. And then I
Yes.
got this other one called diagnostic assessment note, but I think that was just prior to this psychological testing, but.
So that kind of testing, to be honest, is probably more accurate than the Gibson test, because it
Okay.
was actually done by a diagnostician, and looking at specific learning disabilities, and done in person with her. One of the challenges with the Gibson test is we can only it's measuring how she reacts to the computer screen and stuff. And sometimes you can sustain attention for a short period of time.
Mhm.
And we can't control the environment.
Yeah.
So this is why I do recommend, if the Gibson test it's a good snapshot, but if it seems a bit off, I would defer to more robust testing, which is the kind that what you're describing, a diagnostic test like that probably is accurate.
Okay. Okay.
So-
I have one more quick question. The area that she struggles with the most is math. And on this Gibson test, she scored the lowest on visual processing, which again, I'm like, that does not seem like her, but then the logic and reasoning. So I would assume that would be closely related to the math struggles.
Depends on the type of math. How old is your child?
She's almost 11.
Okay. So yeah, math at her age is becoming more logic oriented. I mean, for a young kid, 6, 7 years old, a lot of it's just memorization.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even have to know what the math means if you can memorize the math tables.
Mm-hmm.
Visual processing becomes really critical for certain types of math, like reading a story problem and being able to translate into pictures. So, story problem that talks about there's a train going north out of Fargo. It's going 15 miles an hour. There's another one going west, and it's going 23 miles an hour. And then another one, when are they going to intersect and stuff? And if you can translate that to a picture, you can draw it easily. But if you don't have good visual processing, that's hard to translate into a picture.
Mm-hmm.
So much more complicated math can become where visual processing can come into play. So a skill like geometry becomes much more
Right.
visual oriented. So it depends on the type of processing. Most math involves, a combination of all these things. Again, it's not just logic. It's working memory. Can you hold this information in your head long enough to think about it? Can you translate it into a picture to understand it?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is where these different skills play together differently.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question.
Go
So
ahead.
our daughter is 8.5. She's a struggling reader, but she scored above average on everything except for the processing speed.
Mm-hmm.
Does that really have anything to do with the struggles I would see in her reading?
Yes, you say she is a good reader.
A struggling reader.
Struggling reader.
Yeah.
Yes. And when you're 8.5, processing speed often can impact things like fluency. Can you synthesize things quickly on the fly? So yes, it very much can impact reading.
Okay.
If you score well on like auditory processing.
She was 67th percentile.
Okay. Yeah, and realize again, the auditory processing on the Gibson test, it's multiple choice. So she's picking from options. Whereas we might, this where it might be beneficial to do an in-person assessment where we can have the assessor actually have her sound things out, and we can get more precise in terms of what the different skills are.
Sure. Sure.
But it's entirely possible a profile like that would be a struggling reader, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the other area processing speed would impact would be word recognition,
Okay.
right? She would be slower to be able to recognize words and
Yep.
make her
Yeah.
the slower, more choppy reader.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense.
I have a question.
Okay,
I
I'm
had,
gonna get to you in a minute.
sorry, were you not
Tanya.
done?
No, somebody else had raised their hand. I just.
Oh,
heard
okay,
them
sorry, I
on the
couldn't
back
see
end.
them. All
No,
right.
go right ahead, Tanya. You can't probably see
Okay.
it all.
So I had actually had my son tested a couple of years back when he was 6, not through you guys, through somewhere else. And he had scored, he was superior in 5 different areas and he was average in 2. And the one that his lowest average was not processing speed, was attention cluster. And so like following the step-by-step instructions. So we noticed that even though he's quote unquote average, for him it's like a real struggle because he just chooses not to try, because he actually has to try with that. Everything else he doesn't have to try. Is that something that as time goes by, like would that get worse for him, or will it in general it just kind of stay average?
It depends. Again, that willingness to try is often a hard one to overcome. And it's often not that the child is, lazy. A lot of times it's just when something's hard, you don't want to do it.
Mhm.
So they will avoid those things.
Mhm.
And whether it gets worse or better depends upon how willing they are really to dig in and work at it. If you work
Mhm.
at something, you can definitely get better at it.
Mhm.
But then also, a lot of times when you're trying to homeschool and they start to dig their heels in, it becomes yes,
Yeah.
and they counterproductive. And this is where a lot of times our trainers will be very good at working with a kid, not just to get them to do it, but actually to develop the grit that you can try again and learn that lesson that if you put yourself out there, you're going to get better at it. But that's more of a personality things. And when a child has that personality they don't want to try, it's hard. But you can also understand that when something's hard, your natural inclination, you don't want to do it because it makes you
Mhm.
feel dumb, and you'd want to do something that makes
Yep.
you feel smart.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Paula, you had a question. I know you were trying to raise your hand a minute ago.
Sure, no problem. Do you ever see on the testing if they struggle with something really bad because they just did not understand the actual test itself? Like what was being asked of them at the time?
It can be. Again, on the Gibson test, I don't always know how, again, because they're doing it on their own.
Sure,
When we're in person, we can tell if they're getting it and then
Okay.
explaining it. It is possible that, if you got a score that's completely out of left field, just, like 1 percentile or something, it may be the child didn't try.
okay,
Because if they don't try on the Gibson test, they won't get good
right,
scores.
yeah,
Particularly like the
okay,
processing speed one, if they're not attempting to do it quickly, if they're just sitting there not trying, the test will give up on them after a while. The way the
Okay.
whole thing is structured, it gives them so many errors, and once you make too many errors, it stops asking because it assumes you
okay,
are not capable.
okay,
So again, if you got a really weird score or something doesn't seem right,
yeah,
it doesn't. It may be worth following up with us, and we can do a
sure,
more robust test to try and validate that or not.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. So one thing I'd love to spend just a minute kind of explaining to you guys, when I say cognitive training, what some of that means. What we do, so the testing is really very useful. This is a first step, and I think even having this information is helpful to parents to understand how their kid learns. Most of these skills are things though you can't teach. No matter what you do, no matter how much you're teaching, you're not going to teach them to go faster. If you just tell them to hurry up, they're not going to go. They're just going to get frustrated. But the training is what we do. If you consider learning RX, what we do is after we do the testing to actually improve these skills, it's a training program, and it's done repetitiously. And just to give you a little more information on kind of what we do with kids, there's a huge difference between teaching and training. And the way I always describe training, it's like having a personal trainer for your brain. It's not teaching is imparting knowledge. Training is building skill through exercise. And a good analogy to understand this is actually doing work with your muscles to make them stronger. And it's like, if you want to learn how to play tennis, you can read a book about playing tennis, you can read everything and know everything about it, but you're not going to be get any better at it till you actually get out there and swing the racket. You do it over and over until your muscles develop that skill. That's what we mean by training. And so when we work with people to improve training, we do this test, as they said, we do a more robust test as the first step. And then it's one-on-one training. It's actually hours of training. It's not just on a computer. It's not something casual. It is work with a trainer for an hour to the point where your brain is tired. Just like if you work out and lift weights, you don't just want to lift a little bit. I don't do anything by lifting this pencil. But if I'm working a muscle with a weight to the point where it's fatigued over a period of time, that's going to make it stronger. And we also, in our training protocols, we do measurement at the end. So we'll use a test like this Gibson test at the beginning. And at the end, we'll circle back. It's usually several months later. And you can typically gain about 20 percentile points. When you think about a kid who is maybe like at a 40th percentile, if we can move them there to a 60th, that takes them from being below average to being above average. And we do find this kind of training, if you do it right, is retained. And once we can get kids over that hurdle, particularly you think something like reading, like my daughter was a struggling reader and she could not do it. And she fought us and she hated it. And once we got her doing this, now she could do it. Now she could catch up. And this daughter I had who struggled as an 8-year-old is now in graduate school. And she can, and learning RX and doing this is a turning point. And so when a kid hits the wall, what I find, and they're just not making progress, everything you're doing is not working, this is a good way to think about how do we bust through that and actually take a different approach. And that's what, when we talk about training. So that's interesting to you. Feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to meet with you in detail and explain some of that more too. But I just want you to know that these numbers you have with your kid, they don't have to be there. They will get better over time, but they'll just kind of stay relative to other kids. And if you want to get them back on track, training is a really effective way to help really close that gap. So feel free to reach out to any of us, through email or back to, as I said, we work with people of all ages. I'm gonna try and get to, oops. Anyway.
Yeah, I would say too, if you were at the conference this weekend, stop by our booth. I mean, you can, some of you asked if you can bring your test results, and yeah, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. Also our lead researcher who actually heads up the Gibson Institute of Cognitive Research, she's doing 4 different workshops or presentations around cognitive skills and training your kids, teaching your kids. And so I'd really recommend trying to get to some of those, because I think that would be really helpful, especially as a follow-up to the test that you just completed for your kids.
If you're a podcaster, Dr. Amy, who Rich is talking about, also hosts called the Brainy Moms podcast. You can either Google Brainy Moms, or you can find that on the learningrx.com website. It's a interesting podcast. They will talk about different topics about learning issues and cognitive skills on a regular basis. It's free and something worth signing up for as well. All right, well, we're at almost exactly an hour. I really appreciate you guys doing this test. I hope you found